like I said, my name is Mina. My official title is front-end developer at a company called Perigo, but I like to refer to myself as a baker of cupcakes and the maker of the interwebs, because it's basically how I spend my life. I make cupcakes and I make the internet. But like, seriously, really do love cupcakes. I'm not joking, people. In order to get through this presentation in a timely manner, I have to make a few assumptions about you guys and your knowledge. First of all, I'm going to assume that you're a little bit familiar with Sass, mainly mixins and variables, because that's the bulk of what I'm talking about. I'm also going to assume that you've heard of Foundation 4, which is my CSS framework of choice. It's basically like Twitter's Bootstrap, but in my opinion, it's a little bit better, but that's an entirely different conversation. And I'm also going to assume that you design and you build your websites mobile first, which if you don't, you really, really should. One small thing, when I say Sass, I really mean Sass and Compass. Compass is like a library of mixins that are created for Sass, and I tend to use them both in tandem, so just kind of keep that in mind. And also, one pet peeve of mine, it's Sass, title case, not Sass, uppercase. It's not really an acronym, so do not write it that way. I have had this argument a couple of times, but it's a little pet peeve that irritates me, so moving on. I also have to give a quick shout out to Code School, because this is actually how I learned Sass. So if you're looking to learn the language or pretty much almost anything to do with web development and you don't know where to start, this is a great resource and I would definitely suggest it. Okay, so getting right into it, why do you really care about Sass and why should you start using all of this stuff? Well, basically, my first thought is, do you use presentational classes in your markup, which can come from using CSS frameworks like Twitter, Bootstrap, and Foundation 4. There's nothing wrong with doing it this way, but Sass actually can make it a little bit easier for you to take those classes out of your markup and still create very complex grid systems and layouts. Secondly, do you group all your media queries at the bottom of your style sheet, which most people do. And again, there's nothing wrong with doing this, but in order to create a little bit more modular CSS, Sass provides a way for you to nest those media queries inside of your base style, so that way you can keep everything related to that particular element in one place. And lastly, do you use conditional classes for IE, which, again, most people do. And Sass is not going to be able to eliminate that need, but it can, again, make it much more cleaner in your style sheet, so you don't have to do a lot of scrambling trying to figure out where you put something. Okay, so basically we're going to get, lots of baking metaphors, I'm sorry in advance. But basically we're going straight into mixins. Mixins are a way for you to use bits of reusable code in your Sass files. You just kind of define what the mixin is, you define what it does, and then you can include it in several places in your style sheets, and it'll spit out the exact same thing. There are pros and cons to using mixins, and I'll touch on those a little bit, but since this is a talk about how to use those to your advantage, I'll kind of get into it. Grid mixins will allow you to basically define your grid and your layout in the element itself. So instead of, I'll use Foundation 4 as an example, instead of putting in your markup div class large 2 columns, you can stick the 2 columns style, 2 column mixin in the element itself, and that way you can leave your markup basically very clean and you don't have to deal with all of those presentational classes. Here's an example of how you do it with Foundation. Again, it's my framework of choice, but Bootstrap and other frameworks pretty much work the same way. You would first define the mixin, give it a name, and inside the parentheses is an argument that you can either define a default, which is happening here, or you can just define it later on when you're actually including it. So this mixin would create a row for whatever element you actually use it for. This mixin would create the actual columns, define how many columns it spans. And there are several other arguments that Foundation uses to give you more, even minute control over what the element does. So an example of an argument would be nest. If you define the variable behavior, if you leave it false, then nothing happens. But if you make it nest, basically it'll give you a way to nest values elements inside other elements without having to, again, define the nest in your markup. Also, define a center true, basically does exactly what you would think it would do. It defines the styles for centering elements within other elements. Offset, you would basically define how many columns you want to offset this by. If you want to offset it by 2 or 3 columns, you define the number in the variable. If you don't need to offset, don't worry about it. Push, pull, again, the same way you would think it would work. If you need to push your layout, the content to the front, depending on what viewpoint it is, you define how many columns you want to do it by, or if you want to pull it, same thing, define the number of columns. And this is an example of basically what my Sass file would look like when I'm using these things. You see, I include the grid in the header, the grid row in the header, and then I define how many rows the image takes up in the header. Again, sorry, Jake, I now feel shame that I'm actually using header as opposed to using something more semantic, but it is what it is. This is a media query mixin, which I'll talk about in just a second. But basically, you see this entire thing is defining what happens in the header. I'm defining the header takes up a full row, the image itself takes up 4 columns, but within this media query, the navigation will take up 4 columns within this media query, and it'll be floated right, because I'm defining the different arguments. I actually figured out later on that I'm pretty sure I don't need the rest of these falses because that's the default value, but it was late at night and whatever. And this is the CSS output you would get. You see the mobile styles are assigned first, and include your media query with whatever you need to put in your media query here, and whatever you need to put in your media query for the nav here. Now, getting into media queries, a media query in Sass works the exact same way it does in CSS with one main difference. You can actually nest them inside of elements. So, like I said before, it makes it really easy to put everything to do with that one selector in the same spot. I like this quote from Brad Frost basically because I would like for us to get away from defining our media queries with device widths. Because these type of media queries basically are encouraging you, to design from the device in as opposed to from the content out, which is really what mobile first and the future web, I think, is all about. You need to start with your content and work your way out from there. So instead of just defining your breakpoints whenever, based on whatever devices you think, just start with the mobile, keep going until you think something looks like crap and put a big breakpoint in it, and then just keep doing it from there until you reach your max width or whatever. Okay, and here's the media query mixin that I tend to use. I actually took it from Jake Archbold. He posted something on GitHub. I modified a little bit to fit my needs, but this is basically my secret recipe for getting media queries. I'll go by this step by step so you can see what's happening here. First off, defining the mixin and the arguments itself. You define whatever breakpoint you want it to break at, and then you can define what query you want it to do, which would be min width, max width, or whatever, and then you define the type of media query it is, either screen, prints, braille, whatever. You define these two at the end because if you have a default variable, you need to define it after anything that's required. So there you go. This part of the media query here, this part of the mixin is for devices that don't support media queries. Basically, it's saying that if you don't support media queries and the media query is more than whatever value you set it to stop at, you include whatever content you put in your style sheet. Or you go ahead and just complete the media query itself and put whatever content you need to put in there. These are, let's say you have a certain place where you need to define some major breakpoints, some major shifts need to happen in your layout. I like to define those breakpoints as a variable so that way I can quickly insert them in media queries and keep going. And so that's what this would do. Like, these would be your These would be your default major breakpoints. But if you have a section where you say you have one rogue element that kind of breaks in between your two major breakpoints, the beauty of this media query is you can go ahead and just define whatever that actual value is. Like it breaks at 30 ems. You can stick 30 ems in there for the value, and it'll work just for that one particular element. And here's an example of it in use. I'm using the major breakpoint for small and medium and defining what needs to happen there. Then I'm using another breakpoint where this one element seems to get all weird at 30 ems, so I'm gonna go ahead and put a breakpoint there. And then these are the rest of the base styles that need to happen there. I like to put my includes above my actual defined styles. It doesn't particular, in this case, I don't think it necessarily matters where you put it as long as you make sure that your cascade is going the right way. And this is the CSS output that you end up getting. You see that it defines each media query the way it's supposed to, and then your default styles are here. This is an example of, again, same thing, basic principle with everything with, the variable breakpoints. And you'll see this is the CSS output you get here. Now, if you're paying attention to this slide, you'll notice that there's a couple of media queries that are repeated, and that's partially, well, that's mainly because of the way Sass handles mixins. Sass will repeat mixins for everything. It will, if every time it sees a mixin, it will repeat the exact same thing, even if it is the exact same thing, it'll continue to do that. So when you use Sass for media queries, mixin for media queries, you tend to get a little bit of a code bloat situation where you would say, well, if I wrote it myself, all my media queries would be in one place and I wouldn't have this min width 30 all over my style sheet. So isn't this really a stupid way to do things because it's making everything worse? Well, a lot of people have been hashing this back and forth, and the creator of Breakpoint, which is another CSS framework for Sass, he did some style tests. He ran some tests to kind of see if this really does affect the performance, whether you have the media queries all throughout different places or you have them all at the bottom. And apparently it was been decided, or he discovered, that the difference is really negligible, especially if you minify your CSS. But if you really, really do insist on having everything in one area, if it bothers you that much, you can use this Ruby gem, which is called Sass Media Query Combiner. It basically will do exactly what you think it will do. It will combine your media queries so that it will write it the way that you would normally write it yourself. It'll group everything within a common query so that way you don't have to have that line repeated several times without your CSS. There is, this is the way you use it. Unfortunately, you do kind of have to use the command line to install it. I haven't figured out another way to do it, so if you don't like the command line, this might not be the best thing for you. But basically, it's a Ruby gem. You install it here. You have to require it. If you're using Compass, you can require it in your Compass config file, or if you're using Sass, you can require it this way in the command line. The caveat about this Ruby gem is that it does require Ruby 1.9.2, which is not the default that's involved on Macs. So you have to go through a little bit of finagling to get 2 versions of Ruby installed on your Mac. Also, if you're using it on Windows, Ruby doesn't come installed at all, so you have to go through a little bit of trouble to get Ruby installed on Windows, and then install Sass, and then install this thing. So also, it's not tested on large-scale projects. I don't know anyone who's used it on a large-scale project yet. I've used this gem on my own stuff, and it works great, but it's been small brochure sites without too much complicated things going on, so can't guarantee it'll work for large apps, but worth a try. And also, it will rearrange your CSS, so you have to be careful about your selector inheritance, because it could kind of screw some stuff up if you're not careful. But I mean, honestly, if your CSS is not minified and looks like this, you're just doing it wrong anyway. So I know what you're thinking. Well, what about IE? Where does this all fit in with all of this? Yeah, that's kind of what I thought too when I started thinking about this. It's just like, really, why does IE have to screw up my life every single time? But there is a way you can use Sass to create 2 separate style sheets, one for IE and other browsers that don't support media queries, and one for everything else. In your regular CSS or your regular Sass file, you can set two variables, one that says whether or not it supports media queries, and one for old IE, and set them defaults, and it won't include any of those styles in your compiled CSS file, and just then go ahead and include it like you normally would. For your IE specific styles, or style sheet, and for other browsers that don't support media queries, you define what width you want that browser to stick at so that it'll go through your mixins, and anything that's bigger than that width, it'll just ignore. And then you tell it that it's just true, this is for old IE, and it'll include any styles that you set for old IE. And just go ahead and include it the way you normally would in your markup. So basically, the point of all of this is using mixins can help you to put everything related to that one element in one spot. All of the media queries, the base styles, the IE-specific styles. Everything is right there, so that way it makes it much easier to organize and to find what you're looking for later, and it really makes it, maintenance is very easy doing it this way. I want to talk to you about a couple of resources for learning how to do this, since I couldn't go into really the learning Sass and learning how to do all these things. First of all, there's the Sass document, the official Sass website. It has great documentation on absolutely everything you can want to know. Since I use Compass, I would recommend, if you want to use Compass, look at the Compass site. Again, great documentation. This Foundation 4 is the framework that I use, and I love it. It's built with Sass in mind, so a lot of the things I'm talking about are already built into Foundation 4, so it's very easy to get going. The Sass Way, which is a website dedicated just to Sass, has great tutorials. A lot of the information that I've learned comes from this site. Bourbon is something I haven't used before, but it's basically kind of like Compass in a way. It's just a Sass mixin library where you can use various CSS3 mixin to kind of keep all your prefixes in order. And I've heard great things about it. I haven't actually used it myself, but it's worth checking out. If you don't want to use the command line, but you do want to get started with Sass, I would suggest buying this. It's only $10. It's a great app, and it works perfectly. And finally, this is my own little, it's my own sort of personal mission, is to get more women involved in things like this. This is what got me involved. So I would suggest that you peruse this site and kind of give tips on for women how to get started becoming more visible in the web development community, because we do exist. You just don't see us most of the time. So I would love for more women to be up here doing this thing, so check the site out. It's really helpful. If you happen to look like this anytime when I was talking, or possibly looking at me like this right now, it's not a big deal. I know I kind of went through things fast, and unfortunately I couldn't really explain everything the way I wanted to, but don't really worry if you don't feel like you know what you're doing, because truthfully speaking, nobody here does. And when all else fails, eat a cupcake, it'll make your life better. Thank you. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
How does Bourbon differ from Compass?
Really, it's the same thing, just it's done by a different developer. It does almost the exact same thing. I haven't used Bourbon a lot, like I said, so I can't tell you nitty-gritties about how it differs, but like I said, it pretty much does the exact same thing Compass does. It's just a different library to do it. Okay.